So I think with everything going on in the world with like Iran, we keep hearing in like the media, like, oh, they've been an enemy of America for 47 years. I think we have short term memory as Americans. You
Mm.
know, we
Hmm.
not very good at history. So I want to go a little further back than 47 years. I want to regale you with a tale, if you will, of who may be the most consequential human being in modern history, who has one of the largest butterfly effects that gets us to the geopolitical climate that we're in today. Are you familiar with a man named Gavrilo Princip?
Ooh, it sounds familiar, but
So he is
enlighten me.
he is his name is typically a little overlooked. He is much more famous for what he did. He is the man who assassinated Archduke Franz Ferdinand and kicked
Okay.
off World War One. Why I say he is one of the most consequential people in human history, and everything that happens today can be led back to him. I'm going to kind of walk you through this butterfly effect. I'll try to, I can nerd out on this shit, so I'll try to stay
Mm.
a little out of the weeds, but we will wade in a little bit.
Mm.
So he assassinated Archduke Franz Ferdinand, who was the heir to the Austro-Hungarian Empire. This was in 1914. He he murdered Archduke Franz Ferdinand's wife. What happens after this is over the course of about a month, a few things happen. Europe is in a powder keg at this point. All the empires are kind of allied with one another, setting up a situation that if a war breaks out, it's going to bring all of Europe into it.
Yeah.
So, over the course of about a month, Austria Hungary, they're allied with the German Empire at this point. They go to Germany and say, hey, we kind of want to punish Serbia for this because he is a Bosnian Serb. He But Serbia is allied with the Russian Empire. Austria realizes they can't take on the Russian Empire by themselves, so they need Germany's support in this. Germany, the Kaiser at the time, Kaiser Wilhelm, he basically says, hey, let's not jump straight to war, but let's make some egregious demands that basically, you're the victim in this. The whole world's kind of on your side. Let me see what you got. Austria Hungary comes up with this list of demands. Most of them are pretty unreasonable, but things Serbia might give into. The big standing point is, I believe it was Austria wanted Austrian police to investigate the murder, and they wanted them to have authority inside of Serbia to make arrests. They would be basically more powerful than the Serbian police. They knew this was going to be a non-starter for Serbia. This could be used as like a casus belli for war,
Yep.
and could potentially keep Russia even out of it as like a hey, they gave you an opportunity to avoid war. You kind of chose this. Once Austria-Hungary shows this list of demands to Germany, Kaiser says, all right, cool, send it out. And then he fucks off on vacation for a month.
Mm.
When he comes back, there's a bunch of details. Basically, at this point, Austria hasn't acted yet. The Kaiser kind of rightfully freaks out and is like, hey, it's been a month. You're kind of losing goodwill. Maybe do something. Uh, as you know, at this point, Austria, Hungary, and Serbia, they don't see eye to eye. Austria declares war on Serbia. Russia declares war on Austria in response. Germany declares war on Russia in response. France declares war on Germany in response. Then you get, the invasion of the lowlands. England gets involved. Whole mess.
Hmm. Yep.
After in the first month of World War One, I believe it was like 1.5 million men died in France. But not Frenchmen specifically, but in the fields of France. At the end of World War One, you have four empires that have gone and completely fallen. You have the German Empire has fallen, the Austro-Hungarian Empire is dismantled, falls apart, the Ottoman Empire falls, the Russian Empire falls in the Russian Revolution. They become the USSR. You have a bunch of new countries. This all sets the seeds up for World War II. Because after World War One, a big reason for World War II was the Treaty of Versailles. German nationalists, actually, ironically enough, you can kind of
German social nationalists.
well, so that's another thing too. Is the people that complain fascism and the people that complain socialism. Fascism was made because Mussolini got kicked out of the Socialist Party. Fun fact: the fascists were all originally socialists who were kind of a little too extreme for the socialists. They got kicked out, and then they made fascism. But yeah, a interesting correlation between like present day and pre World War II Germany is you saw like a lot of single nationalist conservative men join the fascist party, and that's one reason it got it. Like the brown shirts were
they were what, National Socialism.
well, it was just like a lot of like
it was far right, far left. It was a weird mix.
Well, my point is more, it was like a bunch of disgruntled, like, single men, like we would call them today incels, that then went and played, like, paramilitary for Hitler.
Strange.
So that's just a cool tidbit there. But, as you know, World War II breaks out. You have the German Reich. Again, you have Britain and France. You have the Russians. So this butterfly effect keeps going even after World War II. You have, think about like Korea and Vietnam. You have the rise of the Chinese Communist Party. These are things that are based off of the USSR, you know, the socialists, that wouldn't have happened had it not been for the Russian Empire falling, and during the Russian Revolution. You know, you get up to think about the Middle East, current day Middle East. You wouldn't have Desert Storm potentially because the Ottomans were already kind of on the downswing by the time World War One broke up. They were considered the sick man of Europe, but you know, the reason a lot of the problems we have in the Middle East and Africa today, but parts of North Africa. A lot of that has to do with once the Ottomans fell, Britain and France took over that territory. Well, during decolonization, they drew
the British.
The British and the French, God bless their souls, they just drew arbitrary lines on a map and said, hey, these are the new borders of your country. Think of like the Rwandan genocide, for example. The reason that happened, you had the Tutsis and the Hutus, and they hate each other and they were put in the same country. Now, granted, that you could have had war if they were in separate countries, but you have this mass ethnic cleansing happening because of arbitrary lines drawn on a map by Britain. In the Middle East, this is happening because if the Ottomans had collapsed from within in, you know, a series of uprisings and stuff, you would have had much different borders than you do today. So a lot of these
those ethnic cultures creating their own borders, their own safe areas.
Right. So when the Ottomans fell as a result of World War One and Britain and France took that territory in the 50s and 60s, when they decolonized and they drew these arbitrary lines on the map, you start getting a lot of these conflicts that pop off. You think I would argue, one of the most consequential nations in the last 50, 60, 70 years, Israel, is a direct response to World War II. Think about all the shit that they are involved in nowadays. You know, again, think about China and Taiwan. You have that because the Chinese Communist Party takes over China, and that is a direct result of the socialists taking over in Russia, which is a direct result of the Russian Federation collapsing into civil war. Granted, some of these things may have happened anyway, but fun little thought experiment of how different the world would be had one man not shot another man in a random Serbian city.
Yeah. I mean, hey, one man can change the world.
I don't
have
know.
lasting effects.
I don't know if that's the message for that. I don't know if that's the takeaway from this.
Oh, one man can affect history in
So
a weird, arbitrary way of of violence and repeating history.
so like it's interesting to think about with our, again, like let's use Iran. Now Iran has always kind of been around. Iran has a very long history as the Persians and
Yep.
the you know, you get multiple empires in that region throughout history. And the British had been dicking around in Afghanistan and India. They weren't necessarily a direct result of the Ottomans collapsing, but Israel after World War II, getting that territory in Palestine, and then now somehow being able to blackmail our entire government and um, now
And
we have a
influence.
war on the other side of the world that with a country most people couldn't point to on a map a month ago.
Yeah. That's increased, fuel prices to damn near $5 a gallon. Bad decisions all the way around.
Well, and like that's the other thing about our short-term memory is I sent you that interview with Hassan Mehdi recently where he was talking about, in America we talk about Iran 47 years ago. They've been our enemy for 47 years. For 47 years they've chanted death to America, this, that, and the other. But their history goes back to, when we helped the British and the Israelis overthrow their government and install the Shah originally. They had a fairly modern and liberal society over there, especially in comparison to nowadays.
We overthrew a government because it didn't align with our interests.
Well, it didn't align with really Britain's interests. So that's another interesting thing. Again, going to the fall of the Ottomans, when one of the territories that was taken when the Ottomans fell was Britain took over Egypt. A very similar thing almost happened in Egypt when Egypt tried to. I believe they wanted to own the Suez Canal. I believe at the time, I forget the entire story, but I think at the time the British were like leasing the Suez, and that lease was like coming up or something like that. And Egypt was about to just say, "Hey, we're nationalizing this and we're owning it," which could have been very disastrous for the world economy if they wanted to start tolling it or what have you. So Britain and France, whose militaries were still in shambles at the time, post World War II, basically begged us to send a bunch of destroyers and battleships over and threatened to blow up Egypt if they didn't capitulate to the British.
So what you're saying is post World War II, the U.S. has been influenced by allies to make poor decisions. Suez Canal, Vietnam War, Korean War, Desert Storm, Iraq, Afghanistan War, current war with Iran,
Bosnia.
Bosnia.
Again, that's another one that's directly linked to.
U.S.
World
hasn't
War I.
necessarily made decisions in its best interest, but rather allied interests.
I don't think that there has been a situation post World War II that you could really argue in good faith that America has made a decision in its own best interest coming to when it comes to war specifically. Yeah. I mean, you think if we just go down the list real quick, Korea, what outside of the argument of like McCarthyism and hey, we need to spread the stop of communism, what was in that for us?
Nothing. I mean, look at Vietnam. Vietnam was a French colony, right? And there was a communist uprising. We had nothing to do with Vietnam.
No, we went over there because the French basically begged us to.
And eventually, over time, I think it was like 56,000 American soldiers died.
I don't have the exact numbers.
I don't have the exact. It was a stupid amount, and uh, there were protests.
58,000.
Yeah, 58,000 Americans lost their lives in a war that had really nothing to do with us. It was an allied interest, French interest, but they convinced the United States that, we had to stop the spread of communism. It affected capitalism, it affected freedoms. If Vietnam today is a communist nation, they're potentially an economic ally of the United States and an ally in their hatred of China, a fellow communist nation.
Enemy of my
Was
enemy.
the enemy of my enemy. Was the Vietnam really necessary? Looking at today,
Well,
in our shared interest.
that look at
'Cause I think they fought a war. What was it, like 71 or 73? The Vietnamese, I believe, they won that war with
are you talking
definition
about
of one.
the one where they attacked was it Cambodia?
I think it was when China attacked Vietnam. I think it was 71 or 73.
Oh, I would have to look that up. I'm not sure on that one.
Yeah, so my bad. 79.
Okay.
79. So two communist nations fighting.
Actually, fun fact, that is surprisingly not as uncommon as you would think. The USSR and the Chinese
China fought
almost went into nuclear war.
over an island
The only reason it didn't spiral
in a
into
river.
nuclear war is because China. Ironically enough, China was trying to ally with the U.S. to take on the Soviets. And
Yes.
the U.S. was basically like, "Hey, how about you fuck yourself?" And I
Mhm.
swear to God, if you guys start throwing nukes at each other, I'm gonna kill all of you.
Yeah.
But
So I mean,
moving in past that, you look at like Desert Storm. The only real argument there was the oil was of strategic interest to the
well,
U.S., but we make our own.
who influenced the United States in saying like, "Hey, Saddam has the capability or capacity to develop nuclear weapons of mass destruction"? Who was it that said it?
Listen, it was a very Israeli threat.
Could have perhaps maybe been, a certain,
Nation that's been crying wolf
mentor
for 50 years.
mentor of somebody who is currently doing the same thing.
The only argument you can really make of the U.S. having a war that was really in its own interest was arguably the Gulf War for the oil, which again we make our own. We didn't even
True,
really
but I
need
mean,
if we wanted to. If we
who
wanted to,
supplied both Iraq and Iran weapons in that war, in Iran and the Iran-Iraqi, conflicts?
right?
We supplied both sides,
Mm-hmm.
with chemical weapons, with weapons, uh, harpoon missiles, all kinds of stuff.
Yeah, we were arming the Taliban. When the Soviets got involved in
The Soviet
Afghanistan.
occupation, yeah.
We've been arming that area for a very long time. But
So post World War II, most conflicts across the entire globe have been one way or another influenced by allies and munitions and armaments supplied by the United States.
I would argue the only ones that you could really slightly in good faith argue were our little excursions into South America in the 80s. Just because if you're arguing that we didn't want communism in our hemisphere.
Yeah, the Monroe Doctrine.
But even then, we were
Monroe.
still, fun fact, not exactly the bad guy or not exactly the good guy, rather, excuse me, because we were helping literal fascists and people that like had ex-Nazis in their like government.
Yeah.
We were allying with was it Pinochet, that his favorite thing was he had like secret torture camps where he would torture communists, and then his one of his favorite ways to execute them was fly a helicopter really high and push them out.
Yep.
So we weren't exactly being the good guy down there. The CIA was funding quite a lot of very, very far right dictators that.
What was it? We invaded Panama or Nicaragua because of like the dole company
Yeah,
who makes
the banana war.
the banana rewards, Banana Republic.
Well, so that's very. This is all very interesting too. So, like, think about that. When communism, again, like to bring this back to just the initial thought of like this butterfly effect.
Yeah.
You know, a guy in Serbia kills a prince, and 70 years later, communism, which might never have gotten a real hold without that, is spreading into South America. So the CIA is funding terrorist groups down there to go, more or less funding terrorist groups and far right governments to hunt these people down and kill them.
Yeah. And to your point, post World War II, maybe it's an information campaign. Maybe it's a lot of deception going on, but people forget history, whether it's decades or decade. Look in our lifetime since I was born in '91. You have Desert Storm. You have Afghanistan. You have Iraq. You have sure. I mean, you can Afghanistan. Sure, there's a reason why we invaded Afghanistan and hunting Bin Laden and the Taliban, but again, we supplied them the Mujahideen with, I think it was the Mujahideen, right? No. Yeah, it was the Taliban and the Soviet occupations, and we've supplied and we've set up all of our conflicts literally since the 80s. Every conflict that we're now fighting was something that we had a hand in at one point in time, influencing one group or another, supplying one group or another. I think that's what you're saying is the butterfly effect is.
Well, that too, yeah. I mean,
people forget history, and it's like, well, in these conflicts, and it's like, well, yeah, the U.S. has had a major hand in influencing these conflicts that our military engages in. We've been influenced by supposed allies to commit large resources, military sources, economic resources into conflicts that don't necessarily, help us in any way. Well, economically, they hurt us, or influence-wise, they hurt us.
Well, think about like to your. I have two thoughts. To your point of like things that hurt us. Think about like, I would argue as of right now, I've told you before. I think Iran is Trump's Ukraine.
Yes.
Putin. I would agree. If Putin could go back in time, he would not have invaded Ukraine, or he would not have done it in the way he did, because he did not expect to be bogged down in the way he
1.5 million casualties for 20% of Ukraine's land isn't necessarily a win.
No, exactly. Now, we're not suffering that level of casualties yet. America is much more risk averse when it comes to casualties. But think about, I was discussing with you earlier today, one of the biggest stories, like was it a month ago, I believe, one of the biggest stories in China and Korea was the fact that the U.S. was moving missile defense assets out of Southeast Asia because they were running low on them in the Middle East. These are things that we can't easily replace. Think about how much munitions we've used to barely to inconvenience the RRGC, really. I mean, when you think about it, the Trump administration touts that like we've sank
the time to rebuild interceptors. We're looking at 3 to 5 years to restock the Patriot missiles. I think the SAM 2s or something like that. It's a naval interceptor or something like that. I could be wrong on that, but like just the interceptors alone could take 3 to 5 years to replace.
Yeah, well, and not even just that. Think about the amount of ordnance we've dropped and stuff like that. The Trump administration keeps touting that, we've destroyed their missile capabilities. That's not true. I just read a report yesterday where they said that they probably still have about 70 to 75% of their missile capabilities left.
So I looked into that a little more, and they have those resources, but they're unaccessible because we bombed the entrances of those underground tunnels. They're still
Well,
the assets are still there. It's just it would take some construction and debris removal to get to those assets.
some true, yes, but
Yes.
others
Yeah.
like they were just fired on the UAE again last night,
Yeah.
with missiles. So it's like they've still got the capabilities to an extent.
Yeah.
So I would argue that this war has not been in our best interest. It has actually weakened us quite a bit. To the other point, that you made, that like we don't learn from history. Again, I would agree. We've discussed this before. We're kind of entering, ironically enough, for this conversation, this very pre-World War One idea of like the great powers determine the fate of the small powers,
Yeah.
and spheres of influence, and as you see, like America's now kind of really reinforcing the Monroe Doctrine. You see with like Venezuela, for example. Russia is trying to lay claims on Ukraine. It's in its sphere of influence. China is doing the same thing with like Korea and Taiwan, and Japan. Um, so this has never boded well for the major powers in the past. I mean, like I said at the start of this conversation, by the end of World War One, you had four of the major empires of Europe, empires that had been around for centuries, were just gone. But
Yeah.
with the signing of the Treaty of Versailles, um, are we potentially looking at a similar thing down the line of like, hey, Russia's clearly much worse than they were 4 years ago. Much worse off.
I
You look at like the Russian Federation, they are a paper tiger compared to what we thought they were. America is like kind of struggling to get interceptors, as we've discussed. Um,
I think
China's China's just doing things at the moment, but
yeah. I think we've entered a new era that we haven't seen since potentially pre World War II, and that's greater power competition. There's multiple superpowers now, right? And this is something as millennials we haven't seen in our lifetimes. But you have China as an economic and military rival to the United States. Russia. At the end of the day, Russia's still a military superpower in a sense that look at they're producing more weapons than the United States is currently, right? But they've been in a war economy since 2002. Uh, so, economically, if this conflict with Ukraine ends, they'll still be a military superpower, and just in the sense of sheer military weaponry production. You're seeing Europe kind of, and especially Germany. Germany's about to have a military budget of like I think like $200 or $300 billion. They're rebuilding their military for a potential conflict with Russia. So you can see a German slash smaller European, you know, superpower or greater power, military power. Economically, not so much. They're not there. Uh,
well,
then you have the
as
United
a
States.
block, they kind of
Post Cold War, the United States has been the global hegemony, right? And I think we're witnessing a realization that, hey, we've lost a lot of industrial base. We've lost a military industrial base. It's going to take years and potentially hundreds of billions of dollars to rebuild our military industrial complex and industrial complex, right? Engineering, manufacturing. This takes time and money. We know as Americans, I think we kind of been blind to the fact that we've lost a manufacturing industrial base, and it's like, hey, this is going to take time and resources to rebuild. We're about to rely on the Japanese and Koreans to build our navy. You should look into that.
well, that's a
We've
large
come to
part
a
of that.
realization of greater power competition. It's no longer an American hegemony. People are right when they say a new world order. It's a new world order of greater power competition.
Well, I don't think it's going to be quite like that. Like I was discussing with you earlier. I was watching somebody talk about Russia's nowhere near as bad as we thought they were. I mean, realistically,
but
you take
they
nuke.
produce more weapons than we do currently.
Right.
Especially, I mean, we're not talking like strategic weapons like Tomahawk cruise missiles or anything like that. Like first strike capability, but they probably have a better drone capacity than we do.
Right,
Um,
but in a potential, obviously take nukes off the table for this hypothetical, but in a potential war between the U.S., Europe, and versus Russia, Russia's not winning that. You know,
True, but they
the,
could definitely have quite a large impact on the European continent,
oh,
especially if they moved into Europe right now. I mean, what if they were to hypothetically attack across all NATO fronts if the war with Ukraine ends? Could Europe defend itself?
well, not without American
I don't
help.
think so.
Not
Not
without.
without American help. And you're seeing that as like maybe with Trump and his current, you know, uh, kind of anger with Europe, what if hypothetically the U.S. pulls a lot of troops and resources out of Europe? Could the Europeans defend themselves in a real way against heavily armed Russia?
Well,
Especially with Russia, manpower wise, they've lost quite a bit, but like they're producing weapons at a crazy rate.
my point was more like if we're ranking countries and power wise, obviously U.S. is on top. I would say China
Yeah,
is number two.
yeah,
I think
definitely number two.
I think the U.S. government kind of realizes that. I think Europe probably even realizes that to an extent. That Russia's probably three, maybe four, depending on if you want to include Europe on that list. But my point is more when we talk about like the global hegemony. That guy I was watching, he was discussing that like China is more than happy with America being the global hegemon militarily
Oh, I mean,
because it doesn't.
we give them free trade. Essentially, we patrol the world's trade
We
routes.
patrol the
We
world's
enforce it.
trade routes. Anytime there's a conflict that pops up, it's Americans that pay for it. It's the American
Yeah,
military that goes
little
in.
fun fact here. The U.S. has the world's largest blue water navy, or the only blue water navy, in a sense of patrolling the world's trade routes, the ability to logistically move military assets. Right. Number two is actually Japan. Fun fact there. They
Didn't know
have
that.
the second most capable blue water navy, just because of like their constitution and warfighting capabilities. Number three is actually China. So interesting little fun fact there. So China, you're right in the sense that China is more than happy with us patrolling the world's trade routes
Well, not even
because
just that.
they don't even have a blue water navy. Their navy, for the first time since ever, has actually gone beyond. Well, maybe you could say go back all the way to the Ming Dynasty, has been able to travel past, I think, the first island chain.
Well,
So
my
good
point.
for them.
Yeah, like that. They're happy for us, patrolling the ocean. They don't give a shit about when a conflict pops off in Africa. They're more
Yeah.
than happy for us to send in the Air Force and shit, and them to sit on the sidelines.
Yep.
And we keep like
Because they
those.
benefit
Well,
without
yeah,
having to pay any resources.
yeah, like we keep those cobalt mines that America and China are fighting over in the Congo. We keep those operational with our military. China doesn't have to do
Yep.
that. So China's more than happy to kind of take a back seat on that one. As far as Russia, they're more focused on expansion into Europe and maintaining a sphere of influence over that. So
Yep.
I don't think like I think when people think like, oh, China is challenging America for the global hegemony. Like I think they view it as, oh, they're going to try to like knock America down, and they're going to become the top military and stuff. China is more than happy in not spending that money there. They're more than happy to focus on other things, to be an economic powerhouse. They might beat us there. I mean, they're
Yeah.
on track to beat us
At the end of the
economically.
day, they are still stealing U.S. trade secrets, U.S. military secrets. It's Xi Jinping has created like a timeline. I think it's like 2049 or 2050 that they want to have a world class military, and essentially it's like, hey, we're going to steal every American technology. We're going to be at the same capability as the U.S. military. and we see that as a threat. It's not necessarily they're saying that they might use it against the United States. It's just us kind of like scare tactics of we don't want somebody to be on par with us.
Right.
And I think that's a lot of the misconception. People think, oh, they want to dominate us. They'll be here. They'll be on our shores. And it's like, no, it's just
No,
at the end of the
they
day,
want
it's the military industrial complex saying, hey, they might be on par with us.
they want Taiwan, and they want to be the economic powerhouse.
Yes.
They want security for China. Like I think people don't understand either. Like, some countries are kind of okay just being operating within their borders. Like, if you, from the Chinese point of view, Taiwan is Chinese. So for them, that's them operating in their borders if they went to war for Taiwan. They're not talking about, hey, we're going to take over Japan. They're not saying, hey, we're going to take over Korea. China's kind of happy to just chill in China. Russia's, they want to expand, territorially.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of threats that come with a China that you never know. Sure, you're talking Chinese culture, but what if there potentially is a leader in the future? Maybe it's not Xi Jinping. Maybe it's the guy who, is following him that's more expansionist in their ideology, right? Maybe they're like,
fair.
hey, well, why can't we expand into Korea? Why can't we expand into Southeast Asia? The Vietnamese are clearly worried about something, right? At the same time, they're economically becoming more closer to the United States. There's talks of like potentially military, like shared naval bases between us and Vietnam. Clearly, the Vietnamese are worried about something, and they're seeing something. So you don't know what's to come in the future.
Yeah, no, that's a fair point. But I would say, like, currently, like, I think China is just more focused on monetarily dominating the United States. Think about, because that's the other thing too. People, like, a war between the U.S. and China, like, that's going to hurt China economically as well, because they have a lot of debt in buying our debt.
Yeah.
Like, people don't realize,
Their
like, the Chinese
debt to GDP is 300%, whereas ours is, I think, now officially 100%. That's when you consider local debt and stuff like that for the provinces and stuff.
That's what I was about to say. The Chinese economy, like, on paper, like the economy they show the world, when you see those graphs, it's like, oh, China's, on track to overtake the U.S. economically by 2030 or whatever. It's like, yeah, but also no. Like, their economy is made up of lies and people not wanting to get executed.
Most of their yearly GDP, I believe, like something like between, like, this is broad, but I think it's somewhere between 30 and 60% of their GDP is local debt for infrastructure projects. Mm-hmm. So it's like tearing down buildings, rebuilding those buildings. It's just keeping people employed, but they can do that with like a $1 trillion trade surplus.
I was thinking about their those cities that they build that no one lives in.
Yeah.
Like, for all the great what's the word I'm looking for? For all the great civil projects that China does, it's like a lot of them are only being done just because they have to be done. Otherwise, the economy collapses.
Yeah. A little side note, you mentioned something about their new train projects and the LEV trains and stuff that they were seeing something like our high-speed rail network costs like $1.7 trillion to build. And it's not even contributing economically to their economy because, like, they'll never be able to pay that debt off for what that generates. But it's more of like you said, a civil project, right? There's some glamour in it.
You can get from, like, Beijing to Shanghai in like an hour.
Yeah, but like those fees will never pay for the cost of those projects. So I've seen something like that in itself could be an economic turmoil for China because it's like that's not even generating the GDP numbers to reimburse the costs.
Well, I think that's a little facetious because, like, you can subsidize, right? Like, the U.S., the road you drive on to work, you don't pay a toll for. So like that's the same argument. It's like, well, that road's not generating any revenue to, you know, build it.
Yeah.
Of what it costs to build it, but we make that money elsewhere, and that's what pays for that. And it's kind of the same with China. It's like, yeah, that high-speed rail system that interconnects all of China, yeah, it's not going to generate a lot of money, but it's vital to, you know, the in other ways.
Yeah, yeah. It's just I forget. I think it was like a German, some kind of German website that I follow, or German YouTube channel. They were kind of like talking about it, and it's like, hey, this is actually in itself, it could cause some economic turmoil because like they borrowed a lot of money to build that, and these local provinces, you know, connecting them, building them. They were such a large, you know, infrastructure projects that they're not paying for themselves, and economically they're not generating the income that they thought they would.
Well, and that's important to talk about too, because like you see a lot of times, I don't know how tapped in you are with like leftist pages on social media and things like
I
that.
try to avoid those at all costs.
Well, so like like you always hear like the, oh well, we've got money to go bomb Iran, but we can't have a high speed train that gets from like New York to L.A., for example, and stuff. And it's like,
Okay.
it's like, yes, I understand that sentiment, but it's kind of infeasible in the U.S. to an extent, just because people, even Americans, really, especially Europeans, that again, I fucking despise Europeans that talk shit and act superior to us. You're not speaking German because of us. You're welcome, or Russian. But people don't realize just how big the United States is. Like a high speed train from New York to LA just really isn't feasible. Like if you interconnected it with like some Canadian cities and stuff, and kind of made it wrap around like up through like the northern U.S. and then kind of coming down the west coast, you could. But like people have this like notion that like you can just build a railway straight across the U.S. and it's like you really can't. It's so you're going through 38 different biomes. It's 3,000 straight miles. There's almost no, you know, there are certain people don't realize like how barren some states are when it comes to like Kansas has like one city in it. You know, it's not like now like a high speed train going up and down like the East Coast, for example, from like Boston to Miami. That makes some sense. You know, you got Boston, you know, Burlington, you got New York, Philadelphia, Delaware, Washington D.C. You know, you can go down into Atlanta, things like that. You've got cities that can connect to that stuff. It makes sense for something like that. You can make a case on the West Coast too.
That and like
cutting across the U.S. is just infeasible.
Yeah, that and like a lot of our highway and interstate systems were influenced by what, you know, Hitler did with the autobahns and stuff like that. And the U.S. seen, hey, strategically we need these interstates and highways to move military assets in a hypothetical invasion of the North American homeland. Impossible by today's standards. Nobody has a blue water navy that could touch any American coastline. Let's just be very clear about that. But we anticipated it. We thought it was possible, plausible back, you know, post World War II. To this day, it's still impossible. You know, you're going there's no blue water navy in the world that can touch a coastline of the United States. Maybe they might be able to, you know, hypothetically damage infrastructure and stuff like that. But that's what influenced the mass infrastructure spending of like building highways and interstates. Economically, that interconnected the continental United States, but like you said, like there's no economic feasibility to building a high-speed rail connecting one side of the United States to the other. It was expand interstates, highways, and economically the United States expanded from there. You know, major cities, major metropolitan areas, Akron, Ohio, New York, LA.
Well,
all that came about from strategically building those interstates and highways. But like you said, there's nothing that could come from a high-speed rail from New York to LA. Nothing.
Well, yeah, like it's not impossible. You could absolutely do it.
Tourism and travel, but you know we can't
Well,
we can't do anything with that high-speed rail that our current, freight rail systems can't do in moving product.
My point was more like to your point of like how China is saying financially on paper it's almost not worth it to China.
Yeah.
There's other reasons, but whatever. But like in the U.S., it's like we could physically do it. Yeah, there's nothing stopping us from physically. There's nothing stopping us. Financially, it doesn't make any fucking sense.
It doesn't. It doesn't. We can move freight with. Yeah, we can move freight with planes. We can move freight with our highway and interstate systems.
You can move freight with the current rail system.
Rail systems, yeah. Like the only thing that a high-speed rail could sure be if you're talking between major metropolitan areas, like between San Francisco,
up and down go from Texas. You could arguably go south and have it go from Florida to Texas to California,
from New York City to Washington D.C. Understandable, right?
Absolutely.
Or L.A. to San Francisco. Absolutely, 100%. Limit those trips, or you'll bring those trips down to like 30 minutes or 45 minutes. But from one side of the continent to the other, it doesn't make economic sense whatsoever.
Yeah, that's one of those things. It's like, now don't get me wrong. I'm not, to kind of circle this back to like the original argument of like, well, we've got money to drop bombs. I'm not in favor of dropping bombs. I'm just saying that's also kind of financially irresponsible to build a 3,000-mile long railway. Like I said, if you wanted to connect it from the south, it kind of makes a little bit of sense. If you wanted to interconnect like an American and Canadian one and kind of go up through the north, you could. I would say like you would still have like an east versus west system though, as far as like, I mean, once you get past Michigan, there's really no need for one. But
yeah, I mean,
you could maybe connect. What do you want to see in Montana? The fucking ranch from Yellowstone? Everyone's going to take the high-speed bullet train out to that.
Yeah.
Go see the make-believe cowboys that fight each other all day.
You guys want to get to Yellowstone in 3.5 hours?
I don't know why you talk about that. You got to say it with a Boston accent.
Sorry.
But yeah. No,
I'm going to butcher it.
Yeah, I'm not going to try it either. But yeah, I think that, like, financially, that's where, like, to kind of circle this back, like, to the whole China and their ambitions, realistically, right now, they're more focused on just economically dominating us. There's no... China's seen how expensive it is to do all this shit, and they said, that America does, and they're just kind of like, yeah, we get all the benefits from America doing this with none of the downsides. Russia, however, Russia's very stubborn and full of stupid people who are stuck in mentalities from 400 years ago of, hey, we need to keep expanding into Europe. That, I feel like, realistically, even though Russia can't, in my opinion, take on the U.S. and Europe, I feel like that would be a much more realistic war outside of like a potential Taiwan scenario, depending on what happens with that. I feel like Taiwan's probably going to be diplomatically done if China can, because China doesn't want a war with the U.S. and the U.S. doesn't really want a war with China. I feel like if any big conflict's going to pop off, it's going to be because Russia drops a nuke in Ukraine. I think that would be a more likely situation of a major conflict popping off, is that sphere of influence. Is Russia's trying to sit there and says, you know what, I'm done. We're going to deal with this Ukraine problem once and for all. And that brings Europe into the fold. That brings America into the fold. Because behind the scenes, I don't know if there's still this policy under Trump. I know under Biden it was basically, hey, if you use a nuke in Ukraine, America's getting involved. I don't know if that's still the policy. But I could foresee like Europe at the bare minimum getting involved, which could drag us into a war.
Yeah, I mean, I think, maybe I'll potentially give Biden credit for this. Was Biden made the threat of, if you use nukes, I will wipe out your entire Pacific Sea fleet, or Black Sea fleet, Black Sea fleet, and potentially strike other strategic targets within Russia. which would be equivalent to us nuking those areas, right? You know, Russia understands that we have the capacity to sure, we would definitely lose some assets, but at the end of the day, the U.S. would win a conflict.
I think more realistically, what's going to happen. This kind of goes. I was telling you about that professor I was watching, and he was saying that the big conflicts he's going to see is he predicts the within the next, I believe it was like a decade or 2 decades or something like that, the U.S. is going to be in civil war. Russia's probably going to be in civil war. He was debating about whether like China could potentially be in a civil war and stuff. I don't think it's going to be that. Not for political reasons or something. I could see the next big conflict being civil unrest, because think about the situation we're in right now, with Iran. You've got a tenth of the world's supply of natural gas is no longer even on the table from those plants that were attacked in what was it, Oman, or the UAE, one of the two. You've got We're already talking about, if this blockade of the Strait of Hormuz goes on much longer, there's going to be gas prices are going to get even higher. We're talking about fertilizers that can't get to the U.S. and can't get to Southeast Asia for farming. We're talking. Think about. I mean, we've already talked about before. I don't know if we have did an episode on it. Think about like water supplies drying up all over the country, all over the world in some places because of data centers and stuff. I could see the next big conflict actually just being civil unrest from resources and potentially lack of food, lack of water. I don't know if it would get that bad. Maybe in certain countries, probably not the U.S. We would always find a way. But think about like some of these, especially some of these smaller third world countries, that if they don't get that fertilizer, that's the difference between them having a crop this year and them dealing with mass starvation. Think about if they don't get gas, that's their economy. Look at Cuba right now. They're doing rolling blackouts because they don't have gas. I could see that being the next big conflict of the 21st century.
Yeah, I mean,
also think Russia. There's still
I don't think,
every.
I don't.
Just real quick. Russia. There's still every couple of months you hear new reports of potential coups going on in Russia because of the handling of the Ukraine war. So like I could see Russia maybe devolving into civil war. They almost had that with the Wagner group, but
I don't see there being a U.S. civil war. I mean, at the end of the day, I mean, people can predict it all they want. At the end of the day, we're still Americans. All it takes is one strike on America. Hypothetically, let's say China or Russia lashes out and attacks the United States and surprises us in one way or another. There's one way to unite Americans left and right. If you attack us, it's on.
I need you to find a way to what you just said, basically an outside force can unite a divided inside force. Can you find a way to get a message to Trump about 8 weeks ago?
Yeah. I mean, let's be honest. If the Canadians were to make an incursion into Montana, you would have Bernie Sanders and Trump hand in hand in the White House saying, "Fuck it, we're taking over everything in Canada."
Yeah. No, I don't see a civil war breaking out in the U.S. I could see like large scale protests, like larger even than we've seen already. And I think you're also seeing this. Think about like the amount I've seen plenty of them. You've probably seen them. Like that, was it Utah recently? That city council, for example, that passed that 40,000 acre data center that the entire town did not want, but they voted for it anyway. I could see like things like that being tipping points for like political violence. I could see, like, we've already seen Trump's had multiple assassination attempts. He just had one 2 weeks ago. I could see more of that picking up in the U.S. I don't think it would be a civil war, and the U.S. is not in a position to have a civil war in the way people think of civil wars.
Yeah, and like I think you and I have discussed this in the past on previous like episodes of like we are nowhere. People feel uneasy about the conflicts between left and right within the United States, but we're nowhere near what we were in the Vietnam War. on a civil case, like, you know, the protests,
Right.
you know, the general angst of like the American population. We're nowhere near that level. Sure, we've had some major protests for other cultural reasons and, you know, newsworthy topics, but like nowhere near the mass protests that we seen in Vietnam. Nowhere near the, you know, the conflicts between government and people that we've seen in, you know, Vietnam with the Kent State shootings and with like the civil rights protests. We're nowhere near that, or I don't see us getting anywhere near that.
No, and
You
I
know,
don't.
even today.
That's my thing. I think like people think Civil War, and they think also like the original American Civil War. Like you had
Yeah.
clearly defined like that's if even if America did devolve into something, it's not going to be like Russia could devolve into something like that. Arguably,
Yes.
even China. America, there's no real unified sides, right? Like
Yeah.
the majority of the people are centrists. Like let's be honest. You're more likely to see in America political violence. You're more likely to
Yeah.
see, hey, my local city councilman voted for. Well, you just saw. I don't know if you saw. Like, I think it was 2-3 weeks ago. I think it was over a data center. Actually, a city council voted for it. One of the councilmen had like a drive-by on his house.
Yeah.
You know, again, you're more likely to see political figures like Trump or even Bernie Sanders face assassination attempts. You know, you're not going to see, hey, me and the boys getting a militia together to go, you know, fight the National Guard or something like that.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that's a lot of fear mongering, especially in like the social media fringes of social media.
Well, that's how you get
Of,
views.
you know, yeah, and it's like at the end of the day, you like you kind of said, there's more of a potential for like small skirmishes or, you know, political
Arson,
assassin, yeah,
looting, large scale protests.
stuff like that than like an American Civil War. At the end of the day, you know, whether I'm more centrist right, I can still go have a conversation with somebody who's hypothetically far left, and we can still agree on potentially, you know, in a realistic conversation of breaking down how we feel about things, can agree on probably 50%
Well,
of things.
I told you, I think I told you recently. You know, we had a situation at work where we had some people in the break room. We were talking politics, and we had a guy who voted for Trump, MAGA, wears a red hat and everything. A guy who is super far left, me, who's very center left. You know, I'm conservative on some issues. I'm very liberal on other issues. You know, I think don't touch my guns, but also give me good health care. You know, and we were all like 99% of the shit we were talking about, we agreed on. You know,
Yeah.
there was some finer details maybe we didn't agree on, but broad strokes, you know, even medium strokes, it was we were all agreeing on shit.
Yeah, I mean,
Like the average American, right and left, agree on more than they disagree on.
and to kind of circle back to what you started everything off by, like one person, the butterfly effect, and how potentially one person can influence history is, you know, I feel like it's coming from both the left and the right of, you know, regardless however you feel about Trump, like this conflict with Iran, and, you know, it was both left and right people understood and potentially appreciated the fact that, you know, during his campaign he said no more wars, no more foreign wars, America first. And like you're seeing it on both the left and right of like people like dumbfounded, like, well, what the fuck, how is this MAGA
Oh,
first?
we're on our second one, and we haven't even finished the second one, and we're talking about a third one with Cuba. It's like
Yeah,
you
I
know,
mean,
you're
I
seeing
hear it from people, you know, my brother who's kind of, you could say, right leaning, very far right leaning in a sense, and you who's centrist slash left can both, you know, both have had conversations of, don't understand why the fuck this conflict's taking place, is impacting me negatively in fuel prices and economically. Why are we there?
Mhm.
Why did this happen? Why did this transpire? I don't see anything about this being, you know, America first.
I think we'll
Those
have
conversations are happening.
I think we'll have to actually have that conversation next time.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely.
This was a good get back into it, but I think we're just like a preview. We're not even it. We've got
We'll
Israel,
snip it into
obviously.
what's coming.
Yeah, we've got Israel obviously playing their share of this, but you're also seeing, as far as like Iran, you're seeing with Cuba, the old guard giving their last death kicks as on their way out. They are starting to lose. They know they're starting to lose. They're getting old. They're starting to die off. You're starting to see that old generation kind of finish the plans that have been in motion for 60 years in some cases.
Yeah, and with baby boomers, I think what they're like mid to end life cycle in a sense. And after that, I think it's what Generation X after the baby boomers,
Something like that. I don't.
X or Y, whoever those fucking entitled people are. But your next biggest block is millennials. Your next biggest voting block is millennials after the baby boomers, and a lot of us are just like, what's in it for me? What millennials are potentially the first generation of Americans who don't exactly have a better life and purchasing power as the generation before them. And I think we're asking those questions of, does this benefit me? Because we're looking at things more realistic and on like a global sense and what's going on, what's transpiring with economically, militarily, and we're saying, is this it's not a MAGA thing, but it's more or less like, how does this benefit me?
Well, and I think to that point, I have two thoughts on it. I think your comment about the millennials, I think they're also, I would say, the first generation that's really had to age into so much turmoil, right? Like you had conflicts with the boomers and stuff. You had Vietnam, you had Korea, things like that. But that was all some far away, distant thing. That
we're more informed.
Well, that too. But I mean, like that was some conflict over there. Like, yeah, sure, there was protests for Vietnam and things like that. Gulf War, that was a conflict way over there. You still had really good things happening here at home. You had good paying union jobs. You had manufacturing. You had the stereotypical, my dad could be a butcher at the local supermarket, and we could have a nice suburban home, and go on a vacation twice a year and have a college fund, and the mom could be stay at home and stuff. Millennials never had that. Millennials grew up with Iraq and Afghanistan. Millennials saw their parents going to war and not coming back in some cases.
Millennials saw the 2008 financial crisis.
Millennials saw the financial crisis. Millennials saw the rise of extremism in politics with the far left and the far right. Bernie Sanders, Donald Trump, democratic socialism versus MAGA. Millennials saw COVID, the pandemic. Millennials have been through technological leaps and bounds compared to generations before. We grew up playing video games on Nintendo cartridges, and now you can stream them online and play a seamless game of Hell Let Loose with 100 players and a fucking 2-kilometer wide map, and everything's runs
millennials
great.
Grew up being able to go play on the playground, then go home and play on the Nintendo Switch, or not the Nintendo Switch, the GameCube. We were on the cusp of the internet era.
Yeah, they've seen a lot, and that's your next voting block. Also, like to your point about the internet. As you said, we're more well informed in part because of that. I forget what my second part was because the train has derailed. However, yeah, I would say that's a good place to end it here. We can kind of talk about all that next time. Why we're there, how this millennials factor into all this, what the future holds for a lot of these countries and stuff. Because we briefly talked about the past in this. There's a future too. Like that also plays into this. Think about to the point of like the butterfly effect with, how did we get to Iran today? the future is also equally playing a part in that. For example, again,
Mhm.
another snippet. Israel is making these moves now, and America is making these moves now because they can see in 10 years the support for these things is not going to be there. The millennials,
Yes.
again, to that point, the support for millennials, who are going to be the largest voting bloc, is not going to be there. These things are not going to be able to fly in another 5, 10, 15 years. So they've
Yeah,
got to
we're
do it
not.
now.
Yeah, we're not influenced by mainstream entertainment media, like potentially past generations. We're, you know, we have a lot more open source information, and we're more informed about conflicts and things influencing those conflicts. So, yeah, I agree. It's the millennials are far more intertwined, informed generation, and what are potentially the lasting effects of this large voting bloc.
Yep, yep. Well, on that
Hey,
note,
hey, we're back.
yeah,
We're back
for now, we'll see
for
how
now.
long. Yeah, for now, we're back, and with that, we're leaving. Okay, bye.
See ya.